Today, we are looking at a sensitive topic, and I want to preface this episode with this statement. My goal here is not to condemn anyone. If you come from a family that has been affected by today's topic, my heart goes out to you. And I want you to know that just because people have made mistakes in the past, that does not define who they are. And it doesn't mean that they can't learn from them and grow in the future. I also know that some people have gone through what we're talking about today by no fault of their own. So just because someone has participated in this doesn't necessarily mean that they were the one who did something wrong. The topic of our text today is divorce. Stick around to find out more. Recorded at the Running H Studio, you're listening to Venture Tabernacle. It's like venture capital, except that the investment is made in your soul. This is where America hangs out to talk about anything and everything from a biblical perspective. I'm your host, Ty Hervey. Join me as we learn to view the world through the objective lens of the Bible. All right, folks, welcome back for another episode of the Sunday Sermon on Venture Tabernacle, where we are going through the Gospel according to Mark, verse by verse and story by story. We are talking about divorce today, and more specifically, God's view of divorce and marriage. Now, did you know, we'll start off with a statistic, that 40 to 50% of marriages end in divorce today. And that statistic also rings true for those who are Christians in the church. And it's a tragedy that can be so easily avoided in many cases if we will just choose now to live by God's standards instead of the world's standards. And so the text we're looking at today is Mark chapter 10, verse 1 through 12. We'll read it together. And he left there and went to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan, and crowds gathered to him again. And again, as was his custom, he taught them. And Pharisees came up and in order to test him, asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" He answered them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away." And Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." And in the house the disciples asked him again about this matter, and he said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." And so what we see here in our text today is yet another attack from the Pharisees. We are getting closer every week and in every episode to the height of their attack as they send Jesus to the cross. But today, they approach Jesus asking about divorce. And specifically, their goal is to trap Jesus, because they knew that divorce was a touchy subject. Even as it is today, that is not something new. This has been an issue for thousands of years, all throughout history. And in their time, there were two main schools of thought among the religious people. One group said that you could divorce for almost any reason. They were very liberal in their interpretation of divorce in the Old Testament, and they took a very loose approach. And the other group was a lot more conservative. They taught that the only reason that you could divorce someone was for adultery. In other words, cheating on your spouse. Now, we know today, because of the truth of the Bible, that the truth is somewhere between those two opinions of their day. But it's outside the scope of this episode to really dig into the biblical reasons for a divorce. What we're talking about today is how Jesus paints the picture of the ideal, what God intended from the very beginning of creation. And so the Pharisees knew that whatever answer Jesus gave to their question, he would offend someone in the crowd listening to him. And of course, Jesus being the God of the universe, he is a tactical genius, and he sees right through their attack, and he answers their question with a question. He asked them, what did Moses say in the law? And we see the conversation in verse 4 moving forward. They said, Moses allowed us to write a certificate of divorce. So we'll pause right here because what they're doing, I want to point it out, is they're trying to justify their sins. They said, well, Moses said, the prophet Moses, they're hiding behind them because they are cowards. They're hiding behind what they thought would justify their sinful actions instead of being bold and saying what they believed and why they believed it. Kind of sounds like a politician to me, but that's besides the point. And Jesus, what he does is he cuts directly through their bullcrap, just like he always does. And if you've ever had the privilege of having God cut through your bullcrap in life, you know that this does not feel good, but it is so good for us. And he tells them in verse 5, it was only because of your hard hearts that Moses allowed this to be so. And to have a hard heart means that you build up calluses on your heart over a period of time where you don't actually want the truth. You don't actually want what is right. You want what you want, and no one can tell you any different. And that's exactly what the Israelites were like with Moses as they wandered in the wilderness. They wanted what they wanted, and they did not want anyone to tell them anything different. So, in an effort to maintain the peace, Moses allowed something that God despised: divorce. And if you look at the Old Testament, it's actually full of these moments where God allowed something to exist that he despised, and he does this because he is an immensely patient God. You see, if God gave us what we deserved when we sinned, humanity would have been wiped off the planet thousands of years ago. We would not exist today. The patience of God is the only reason that we're still even here on earth. And it's the reason that God sometimes allows things that do not align with his word to continue on. So just because something has been going on doesn't make it right. And to prove this point, Jesus paints the picture of what it looks like when it's right. And in verse 6, Jesus explains God's plan for marriage. He says this, but from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. This is God's plan for marriage, that one man and one woman would be married and that they would stay together until death do them part. And he goes on to teach the disciples privately in verse 10 through 12 that if a man divorces his wife and remarries, that he's committing adultery. And that if a woman divorces her husband and remarries, she is committing adultery. Now that may seem a bit harsh at first glance, but this is the ideal that God created marriage to be. And the reason this is so important to God is seen in verse 8, is that when two people get married, they become permanently joined. By the way, the same thing happens when you have sex with someone. And that's why God wants us to wait to have sex until we're married. And when you break that connection, it is something that can never be fully restored. And some of you have experienced the effects of this. If your parents are divorced, no matter how smoothly it went, there is always pain and destruction that is associated with it. If you've been through a divorce personally, you know that the same is true in your life. And that's why I started this message with the disclaimer that I'm not here to condemn anyone, only to open God's word and show you the best way to live that I know how. And so if you come from a broken home, it doesn't mean that divorce has to be your story as well. The problems of your parents don't have to continue to the next generation. You have an opportunity and, dare I say, an obligation to stand up and say, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Marriage is a big deal to God, and he despises divorce. Our world treats marriage like a toy that can be thrown away when you're tired of it. But God says marriage should be permanent. Our world says that marriage is there to make you happy. But God says that marriage is to help you grow towards him. Our world says that you can divorce and remarry without consequence, but God says what he has joined together, let no man or anything else separate. So my encouragement to you is this. If you're not married, when that time comes, make sure you choose someone that you want to be with forever. And that starts today when you're dating. If you don't think that you could be married to the person you're dating for the rest of your life, then you shouldn't even be dating them. Because dating is for you to find the person that you want to marry. It's not to have a bunch of fun. It's not to see how many people that you can have sex with. In his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, Stephen Covey says to begin with the end in mind. And that is so relevant to picking the person that you want to marry. Look down the road and see what that thing looks like. And you can live a life that honors God with your relationships and marriage. And if you're listening and you've been through a divorce, be it by your own fault or someone else's, I want you to know that there's hope for your future. Just because your life didn't turn out to be the ideal that God created marriage to be, doesn't mean that God can't still use you and redeem even the broken parts of your life. Divorce is not the end of the world, but it is something to be taken seriously. And God, I want to tell you, is bigger than the problems in your life. So we see today the ideal for marriage is one man, one woman, for one lifetime. This is the way God created the world. And that marks the end of this episode of the Venture Tabernacle podcast. Thanks so much for listening. We will see you same place, same time next week.